March 1977. Studio One, NBC Burbank. The red tally light burned steady on camera 2, and for 18 seconds, an eternity in live television, Johnny Carson did not move. He sat behind the desk, hands folded, eyes fixed on a guest whose name the audience had cheered moments before. The studio audience, trained by 15 years of rhythm to know when to laugh, when to applaud, when to lean into the joke, sat in confused silence. The applause sign remained dark. The band, Doc Severinson's Tonight Show Orchestra, held position in the wings. No musical cue came. Carson's face, that carefully calibrated instrument of American reassurance, registered something the camera rarely captured: consideration. Not the performative pause before a punchline, not the calculated beat that allowed a laugh to build. This was something else. The guest shifted in the chair. The microphone picked up the creak of leather, and America, watching from 70 million living rooms, felt the temperature change. By 1977, Johnny Carson was not merely a television host. He was the singular gatekeeper of American fame, the last validator in a media landscape still concentrated enough to have a center. An appearance on The Tonight Show could transform a nightclub comedian into a household name, elevate a character actor into a leading man, or resurrect a career the industry had written off. Carson's desk was the most valuable 12 square feet in entertainment, not because of the set design, not because of the Burbank location, but because of the man behind it and the trust he had cultivated with an audience that spanned generations, geographies, and class lines. To sit in the guest chair was to submit to an invisible examination. Carson did not conduct interviews in the traditional sense. He orchestrated emotional transactions, and the currency was authenticity. The audience could not articulate what they were evaluating, but they knew when someone passed the test, and they knew with animal certainty when someone did not. The guest that night had arrived with credentials. A film released that winter had performed well. Critics had been kind. The publicist had secured the booking through the usual channels: studio pressure, favors exchanged, the delicate architecture of Hollywood access. The expectation was clear: a charming anecdote, a clip from the film, perhaps a self-deprecating story about the audition process. 6 minutes of amiable conversation, a handshake, a wave to the audience, and the segment would conclude. The Tonight Show had perfected this format into an industrial process: 4 guests per night, 5 nights a week, 46 weeks a year. The machine ran on precision. Carson's genius was making the machine feel human. But something in the guest's answer had shifted the atmosphere. The question Carson had asked was not aggressive. It was not a gotcha moment designed to embarrass. It was, by all appearances, a standard opening, a soft pitch intended to let the guest begin comfortably. Yet the answer that came back was wrong. Not factually incorrect, though fact-checking would later reveal discrepancies. Wrong in tone, wrong in energy. The guest had arrived performing a version of themselves that did not match the person Carson's instincts detected. And Carson, whose intelligence had been consistently underestimated by people who confused affability with softness, recognized the incongruence immediately. The 18 seconds began not with a decision, but with a refusal. Carson refused to laugh, refused to nod, refused to deploy any of the micro-gestures that signaled to the audience how they should interpret what they were witnessing. His hands remained folded on the desk itself, a prop that had become iconic through sheer repetition, wood grain polished by a decade and a half of nightly use, seemed to amplify the silence. It was not an ornate desk, it had no historical pedigree, but it had become, through Carson's nightly presence, a symbol of American judgment. Not harsh judgment, not the moralizing condemnation of a preacher or the legal authority of a courtroom. Something quieter, and in its own way more absolute. The judgment of a man who had earned the right to decide what was funny, what was sincere, and what was worth the audience's time.
The guest continued talking, filling the silence with words that landed like stones in water. The audience, uncertain, withheld their response. In the control booth, Fred DeCordova, the show's director and producer, watched the monitors. DeCordova had worked with Carson long enough to recognize the moment for what it was, a test. Not of the guest, though the guest was certainly being tested. A test of the format itself. Live television operated on the assumption that momentum could be manufactured, that dead air was the ultimate sin, that anything was better than silence. Carson, in refusing to break the silence, was asserting a different principle, that authenticity mattered more than comfort, that the audience deserved better than a performance they could sense was false, that his role was not merely to entertain, but to protect the invisible contract he had built with viewers who invited him into their homes each night. 18 seconds, long enough for the camera operator to wonder if they had missed a cue, long enough for the stage manager to glance toward the booth, checking for hand signals, long enough for the guest to understand, with creeping certainty, that the conversation had moved into territory the publicist had not prepared them for, and long enough for the audience, both in the studio and across the country, to recognize that they were witnessing something unusual, not a disaster, not a confrontation, but a moment of truth in a medium that specialized in avoiding such moments. Carson's authority on The Tonight Show was never formally granted. NBC had hired him in 1962, pulling him from the game show circuit where he had demonstrated quick wit and an ability to manage unpredictability. But the authority he wielded by 1977 was something he had constructed night after night, monologue after monologue, interview after interview. It was built on competence, the ability to salvage a dying segment, to make a nervous guest comfortable, to land a joke that diffused tension. But it was also built on restraint. Carson knew when not to speak, knew when a silence carried more weight than a punchline, knew that his power was most visible when he chose not to exercise it. The 18 seconds were not empty. They were filled with calculation. Carson was deciding in real time how to proceed. He could redirect the conversation, offering the guest a lifeline and allowing the segment to recover. He could deploy a joke, a gentle ribbing that would release the tension and signal to everyone that the moment had passed, or he could let the silence extend until the guest understood that the performance they had brought would not suffice. Each option carried consequences. The first would preserve the guest's dignity but betray the audience's intelligence. The second would restore the show's rhythm but at the cost of honesty. The third would uphold the unspoken standard but risked making the guest uncomfortable in a way that could not be edited out, could not be walked back, because the show aired live to tape with minimal post-production. In the end, Carson chose a fourth path. He leaned forward just slightly and asked a follow-up question. The question was not hostile, it was precise. It invited the guest to clarify, to move past the performance and offer something real. The audience, sensing the shift, exhaled. The tension did not disappear, but it transformed into curiosity. And the guest, recognizing that they had been given an opportunity rather than a trap, adjusted. The conversation that followed was not smooth. It lacked the polished ease of a typical Tonight Show segment, but it was honest, and in that honesty, it became memorable. Not for the film being promoted, not for any particular joke, but for the moment when a guest and a host navigated the gap between performance and presence on live television. The 18 seconds were dissected the next morning. Television critics, who often treated talk shows as disposable content, wrote about the moment with unusual seriousness. They could not quite articulate what had happened, but they recognized its significance. Some framed it as an example of Carson's control. Others suggested it revealed his cruelty, his willingness to let a guest suffer. But those interpretations missed the deeper dynamic. Carson was not exercising control for its own sake, nor was he indulging in cruelty. He was performing a function that had become inseparable from his identity as a host. He was sorting truth from artifice in real time, using only his instincts and the silent judgment of an audience that trusted him to get it right. The guest's career did not collapse. The film performed modestly. But within industry circles, the story of those 18 seconds circulated as a cautionary tale. Not about Carson's vindictiveness, he was not vindictive, but about the cost of inauthenticity in his presence. You could be nervous, you could be awkward, you could forget your anecdote or flub the setup to your own story. Carson could work with all of that. What you could not be was dishonest, because dishonesty broke the contract he had spent 15 years building with an audience that numbered in the tens of millions.
The desk, in subsequent years, took on an almost mythic quality in the memories of those who had sat across from it. Comedians spoke of it with reverence and fear. Actors described the walk from the curtain to the chair as the longest journey in show business. Musicians recounted the way Carson's attention could make or break the reception of a performance. The desk was not magical. It was wood and microphones and the accumulated residue of countless conversations. But it had become a symbol of something larger, the idea that American culture, in that specific era, still had a center, that there was a place where merit was assessed, where talent was recognized, where authenticity was valued over packaging. That idea was always more myth than reality. Carson made mistakes, misjudged guests, allowed his biases to shape his reactions. But the myth mattered. It provided a shared reference point in a culture that was beginning to fracture into niches and subcultures. Carson himself rarely discussed the 18 seconds. In interviews late in his career, he deflected questions about specific moments, preferring to talk about the show in aggregate. But those who worked with him closely understood that the silence that night was not an anomaly. It was a distilled version of his approach to the entire enterprise. He believed, perhaps more than anyone else in television at that time, that the audience could sense dishonesty, that they might not be able to articulate what felt wrong, but they knew. And he believed that his job was to honor that intuition, even when it made for uncomfortable television. The moment passed into television history as a footnote, referenced occasionally in retrospectives and oral histories, but its significance was not in what happened. A host paused, a guest struggled, the conversation recovered, but in what it revealed, that live television, in the hands of someone who understood its potential, could be more than entertainment. It could be a form of public honesty, not confessional honesty, not the manufactured vulnerability that would come to dominate talk shows in later decades, but the honesty of a moment unscripted and unresolved, where the outcome was uncertain and the participants had to navigate without a net. March 1977, Studio 1. The red light on camera 2 eventually blinked off, and the show moved to commercial. The guest left the stage, and the next segment began. But for 18 seconds, the machinery of The Tonight Show had paused, and in that pause, something had been tested. Not just the guest, not just Carson, but the entire proposition that had made the show indispensable to American culture, that there was still a place where performance ended and presence began. That somewhere, even in the most manufactured medium ever created, truth could find a foothold, and that the man behind the desk, with his folded hands and his measured silence, was the one who decided when that truth was required.